We're being recorded. All right.
Mhm.
I'm going to share the screen and just do some opening prayers, and then we can come back for a little bit of discussion. Does that sound okay? All right. Here are the opening prayers. Sashi Boogie Juji Metata Rira Linchin in the Gembadia Sange Shindu Meta Wagi Dogo Nanda Jinga Jabajo Ilan Guru Rana Mandala Gamne Yata Yami. Sangye Jero Zogi Jonam La Janju Baru Dani Kazu Chi Dagi Juji Gibe Sunangi Dola Benja Zange Dubasho. Sangye Jero Zogi Jonam La Janju Baru Dani Kazu Chi Dagi Juji Gibe Sunangi Dola Benja Zange Dubasho. Sangye Jero Zogi Jonam La Janju Baru Dani Kazu Chi Dagi Juji Gibe Sunangi Dola Benja Zange Dubasho. Those prayers are done at the beginning. The first one is called a mandala offering. And the way that started was way back when the Buddha became enlightened. He was out in the woods and um, it's a long story, but he saw directly the Four Noble Truths and he was able to eliminate the last part of the obstacles to um, omniscience that he was carrying. And he just sat there in the woods for a while and he thought to himself, this is so sublime. This is so amazing what I've discovered. Nobody in the world's going to really understand this. So I should just stay here in the forest. But it said that the gods Brahma and Indra appeared to him and offered the world to him and said, there are many with just a little dust in their eyes. And so if you will teach, many will benefit. And so it's a tradition at the beginning of a teaching to offer this is a representation of the world. You kind of offer it, and it's a supplication for teachings. And then the refuge, and I was talking to somebody about this the other day. Most of us in this country, we have two choices. Either we're raised within a theist religion where the doctrine is that God created heaven and earth, and you are in God's hands, whether you like it or not, whether you believe it or not. And at the end of your life, you'll be judged. And so that's one system of thought. And the other system of thought that we're exposed to, I know there are other religious views that we get exposed to, but that's one of the main ones. And then the other religious view that we get exposed to is the scientific materialist view. There's no God. That's made up by people, wishful thinking. We're out on this boulder hurling through space on our own, and everything has some material basis. Even our minds are just an epiphenomena that arise because of our neural functioning. So those are really two totally disparate views of what reality is. Herman Melville, in his book Moby Dick, there was one scene where he was on the boat and he was looking at this field of whales reproducing, and he was contemplating life. And the character says, either the world's an empty cipher or everything has meaning. And are those two views, right? So Buddhism really is a completely different perspective, but it kind of can account for both of those views. Whether you're theist or whether you're atheist or materialist, um, it really goes a middle path between those two. There was one great Buddhist sage who said, um, "Empty phenomena roll on, That was his that was his statement about reality. And the meaning there is life has meaning if you make it meaningful. And so if you don't, then it's just another experience that will unfold into another. And based on causes and conditions, you're swept forward. However, if you start to um, use your life really well, you can use this very existence you have to steer your future into a really, really wonderful path. So anyway, that's the starting place of the Buddhist path. Did anybody have any thoughts? I know I sent you a really tough article to read. It's like 25 pages long or something, but it gets into that scientific materialist view of the mind versus a Buddhist view versus other dualist views, and then some research there. Um, any thoughts on that? This is your chance because we're about to launch into Buddhism.
My only thoughts are I did have scientific training when I went to college. And so I learned about many forms of energy you do in physics. You know, you have to visit them all at some point. Um, so, but the funny thing is that I've been able to apply some of what I learned there to experiences I had from meditating and being Buddhist. And I actually understood energy even better, if that makes any sense. So I can see why His Holiness feels like he's not afraid of science. He embraces science. And I can see, why that is. And I will just use the example of the many color terras, you know. Um, so if you look at a rainbow, that's light coming through, and we always perceive that just as light that lights up objects, and that therefore we can see them better. But light is not just one color; it's all those colors, and probably many more than we can see in a rainbow. And so I was like, oh my God, that has something to do with like clear light. And it was just so magical when I had that, realization. And there's been other things that when you talk about continuums and all of that, and I did math and I understood zero to be a placeholder and all that, it made so much more sense once I became Buddhist, if that makes any sense, as far as time and continuums and all of that goes. So, um, I think you can be scientific and Buddhist. I don't see the conflict there myself. That's all.
I agree. When I first met Lama Yeshe, he asked me what my parents would think about me being Buddhist.
Hmm.
And I said my mom would probably be okay with it. My dad's very scientific. And he went, Buddhism's a science. And after that, I took that as permission to treat it as such.
I,
And so,
I do have one question for you because especially when we went through, well, mostly Nagarjuna's, I've read other people's, um, poems and stuff like that that were Buddhist, but they talked about atoms before we knew what atoms
yeah,
were. And
yeah.
what's the translation on that atom in Tibetan
In
compared to how
Tibetan,
we understand what an atom is?
the idea in ancient, um, like Pasha Buddhist philosophy was that if
Hmm.
you take a piece of matter, any piece of matter, you can break it into parts. And then you can take those parts, you can break them down into parts. And so those philosophers arrived at the thought, well, what would be the smallest part? Do you ever get to a smallest part, or does
And
it?
actually, I don't think they have technically anyway, because they're still,
Right,
searching for smaller parts. But anyway,
right.
so,
And
but
so
that
then,
was just reasoned out by them. That's what you're saying.
yeah, but there's also the thought, though, that some of those really advanced yogis and
Might
yoginis,
have been able to just.
they had a level of direct perception. It said that there are different types of clairvoyance that come when somebody's meditation gets perfected. And one of them, they call it the divine eye. And
Mhm.
with that, I remember Sarah Makin saying it's like you can look at a wall if you have that level of clairvoyance, and you can look down into the particles that make up the wall. And so I do get a sense that it's a lot of what the Buddha had to say is uncannily accurate. And it's even modern science, it continues to contribute to modern scientific thought. And so it makes you wonder how these ancient sages had that kind of knowledge or that
Well,
kind of vision.
that pretty much was my question. I just didn't know, I mean, what the Tibetan word for atom translates from or whatever. There's sometimes there's subtle differences.
The word is do in Tibetan, and it just means the smallest unit of a particle.
So
But even in the Vaibhashika philosophy, those smallest units of particulate matter, they have a north side, a south side, an east side. Um,
that sounds,
and they
yeah.
have, and that they are made of different um, kind of primordial things.
That would be true in magnetism. It just like everything that I learned also, it's kind of interesting. But anyway, that was just my question. That was something that bothered me forever, and I just didn't have an answer for it.
Well, then on the religious side, in terms of the theistic religions, where Buddhism fits so nicely is like, for instance, if you're into Christianity and you read Christ talking about loving everyone, and anybody who serves the least of these beings is serving me. That's very akin to Mahayana Buddhism, where all life is seen as sacred and valuable, and the ethics are to not harm anyone or anything, and if you can, to help. And so it gets along very well with that. Um, where the difference lies is when you get into the actual definition of what the highest form of spiritual development is. Because in Buddhism, in the Dharmakosha, Vasubandhu said, Lele Jikten Natsoke, which means from karma, all the various worlds arise. And so there's no sense of attributing creation to some deity who created and micromanages everything that happens. There's no sense of that in Buddhism. The sense of the divine is any continuum where the person's eliminated the afflictive states of mind completely and has also eliminated obstacles to total knowledge and has total compassion. And so those beings are seen as very godlike in terms of omniscient, all knowing, all loving, but
Well, that's a
controlled.
thing that Westerners cross me. I don't often tell people I'm Buddhist because of the misconceptions that are out there. You end up explaining things and then they have this look. And so no, I don't like to get into that. I don't consider myself an expert and no, I'm not going to do that anymore. So
Well, the
because
masters,
they think we're basically atheists. You know that, right?
right?
That's
And
their opinion.
atheism,
That's it.
atheism is a term that's opposed to theism.
Right.
Those are Western concepts.
Yes, I know.
Buddhism didn't grow up in that environment. Well, it did in terms of the Hindu, different forms of Hinduism. They had different gods and deities. And um, one of the basic Hindu tenets was Atman,
Hmm.
that the mind, there's a level of the self that's constant and unchanging.
It's
And
almost like a soul, correct? sort of,
Yeah.
which we don't have that.
And the sense is that Atman goes from life to life.
Mhm.
Um, and they developed a caste system for what quality your Atman
Yeah,
is.
yeah, that's pretty wild.
Buddha, Buddha just said, I'm Atman. There's no, there's no
But as
self-existence.
far as the divine goes, this is my feeling. This is just my feeling as a Buddhist or whatever. We all hold some divine spark. It's not that we've developed it to the point of, a Buddha or anything, but I believe we carry that with us. Do you know what I mean?
Well,
So,
that's in one of the nodal texts of Mahayana Buddhism is the Anuttara Tantra. It was attributed to Buddha Maitreya, and it came through his worldly disciple Asanga. And if you read it, it's mind blowing. But it talks about the seven diamonds: Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and then the fourth of those is called Rik in Tibetan, Rik. And
well, what does that mean?
Rik are Giku Ra Giku Ri Gasa Rik um, means like it has different meanings. It could mean a class of things or a status or something like that. But in this context, it gets into the Sanskrit term that it was translating as gotra. Gotra means a seed.
Ah,
And it's talking about the most subtle form of our minds. And the most subtle form of our mind, you've heard the famous word Buddha nature.
mm-hmm.
That's Rik. Buddha nature is Rik. And it has two aspects to it. One in Tibetan is called Rangshin Nerik. Rangshin Nerik means the abiding nature of that Buddha nature. And then there's another aspect to it called Gekirik, or the aspect of that Buddha nature that changes and can grow and can develop, the developing Buddha nature. And so what it gets into, and this is really, when you understand this, it's really exciting because everybody here has a mind, right? That means everybody here has Buddha nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
You got a mind, you got Buddha nature. Um, the abiding or the Rangshan nature, the abiding Buddha nature, is that the mind of clear light, and I mentioned this in the last class. This is from the Prajnaparamita. There is no mind in mind. The nature of mind is clear light. And that's showing those two Buddha natures of the mind. Um, there is no mind in mind is the abiding Buddha nature. Because each moment of mind depends on a previous moment, the mind does not exist self-existently without depending on something else. Its nature lacks any self-nature to it. And that's the Buddha's term, anatman. There is no self-nature to that continuum of mind. It's empty. Its nature is empty of self-nature because it arises dependently.
But
Anything that
when it says
um,
empty, it's saying, I'm sorry. When it says empty, it's talking about lack of ego, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a good word for it. Um, the idea they have it gets really technical, and they have lots to describe it in the philosophical schools. But let's just take that term ego. In the West, Freud used it to talk about the part of us that navigates between id impulses and social conscience and all that kind of stuff. But the way it's been used colloquially is very similar to a Tibetan term called dangzin. And what that means is grasping at an I, grasping at a me. And as soon as that thought comes into our minds, there's a sense of what is mine. So there's this me, and then there's mine. And those are the basic misconceptions that drive the round of suffering. And so when we take our minds and we define them as a independent me, that's ego grasping towards our mind. And as soon as that happens, we've lost touch with what that mind is really. Because it doesn't have, that's a mental projection that we're putting onto our minds as if it has some me quality to it. And it doesn't. It arises as mere awareness and clarity. And its nature is undefined. It has no self to it. And therefore, there's no mind in mind. In other words, not an objective, self-existing mind. It's rising dependently moment to moment. That said, it's also indestructible and it's continual. No physical matter can destroy it because it's immaterial. It's not made out of matter. And so it's beginningless and it's endless. And so that's our Buddha nature. This mental continuum we're now using is gonna keep on going whether we like it or not. Even people who suicide to try to get away from it, it still goes on along with whatever karma that person created.
Well, so that explains why samsara is such a trap, because it's almost like we need objects to feel like we're existing, us and the whatever's outside of us.
Well, ego tries to
Right,
hold things in place.
right,
This is me, this is
right.
mine, and I'm
Yep,
going to
all of this.
accumulate, and I'm going to build a shrine to myself, right? And
No,
then
we're not going to do that, but we know somebody who is. But anyway.
death comes and it's all gone in an instant, right? All we
Right,
got left is the karma we produced trying to
right.
create that.
But I see the trap because, you know, even when we meditate, at least me, it's easier, or I think more to have some kind of object, when you meditate. So to me, I can see what the trap of samsara is, to be in a place that has, you know, all kinds of objects around you, people and things and circumstances and
Well, in Tibetan Buddhist practices, there's just a myriad of different practices, and a
hmm
lot of them try to get you in touch with that clear light nature of the mind.
hmm
It's Mahamudra, the Great
hmm
Seal
hmm
meditations, or Dzogchen, or there are lots of them. And so I wanted to talk about the other part of your Buddha
hmm
nature. One is that empty nature of that continuum of mind. That emptiness itself has always been there. It always will be there, and it abides naturally in you. And so that's when you hear people say, "Oh, you're already Buddha." That
No.
comes out of that
Mhm.
idea that the nature of the mind, your mind, its subtle empty nature, is no different than the empty nature of a completely enlightened being, their mind. Same emptiness. And it abides there naturally. And so it's compared to a buried treasure, that you have, that you've always had. Um, the Gekirik, the developing Buddha nature, there is no mind in mind as the abiding Buddha nature. The nature of mind is clear light. That's the relative aspect of the mind, its clarity and its knowing. That part of the mind's nature, the mind has both those qualities, the emptiness as well as that clarity. That clarity is what we can develop and imbue with different enlightened qualities until it matures into full-blown enlightenment.
Could you give it an example or two of what you are saying is an enlightened quality?
For instance, the development of loving kindness,
Oh, okay, yeah.
compassion, and imbuing the mind with those qualities of loving kindness and compassion and wisdom, the mind that is able
Oh,
to
so that's
discern.
the two branches. That's what you're talking about.
Well, it's a single mind, but it has both
No,
sides.
no, yeah, yeah, it has, yeah. There, it's not, well, anyway.
So what happens to most unenlightened beings, they have the Buddha nature there, but they tend to associate their mind with me and mine thinking. And then based on that clinging and desire, and then based on that hatred or fear of anything that might take away what's perceived as me and mine, and jealousy and pride and all the different afflictions of mind arise out of that original mistaken notion of an independent me. As long as there's that sense of me and mine, then those different afflictions start to accrue. And it's a little bit like if you have clear water, but you pour it in the sewer. By associating with all those afflicted states of mind, the original clear light nature of the mind gets obscured and muddied. Just like that, polluted water can be refined, distilled, and brought back into drinkable, pure water.
Or maybe grow a lotus out of the mud.
Yeah, well, yeah, grow a lotus out of the mud.
Yeah, yeah.
Similarly, our minds can be purified and distilled and imbued with enlightened qualities, unlimited. So anybody here has that seed, that gotra, or that rik, that can be cultivated into the state of complete enlightenment. And so that's a crucial thing to understand in Buddhism.
So I have a question. So you were talking about like she had asked about the atoms, etc., right? So I've been I mentioned it before, but I'm studying Gnosticism, ancient Hermetics, which is like the mystery schools, and then like Plato, Socrates, and then the Buddhist side, right? And I'm taking all the things that they have in common, including like ancient Egyptian beliefs and all that, right? And I'm pulling all the different things out, and I'm seeing like there's a lot of commonalities. The only thing I can find now that resonates with me is Buddhism, right? Out of what's available in society. Um, you were talking about like samsara, right? So like the Gnostics believe that there's uh, the universe was made by the all, or they call it a monad, that created other beings, and then one of those beings created something called the demiurge, right? And the demiurge has this created our reality, right? So what everybody in mainstream religion believes is God is pretty much leading to the demiurge, and it's leading to that reality. On the Buddhist side, you have the samsara and the maya, where it's kind of the same thing, but there's no where the Gnostics believe there's some sort of intent and um, maleficence to the reality itself, right? Which I don't agree with. Even in reading their text, I think that's just translated wrong. Like Western Westernism has translated that incorrectly. Um, what is the difference between, if you know, right? I'm not sure if you're familiar. What's the difference between what they're considering reality versus the Buddhist version of it, where it's the samsara and the Maya? Is there a difference?
Um, you're right. I really haven't studied the same things that you're studying. So I leave you to let me know, how you interpret those things. Um, what got clicked in my mind as you were describing it is a beautiful text by a great sage named Losum Chuki Gyaltsen. And he wrote this text that was a debate between ignorance and wisdom. And it starts out with ignorance trying to put down wisdom. And the argument from ignorance's side is I've been here since the beginning. you came later, like the horns on a bull. But I, ignorance, have been here primordially. And then wisdom said, well, actually, no, I've been here from the beginning too. You just are obscured, so you didn't know I was here. And so it's, that's kind of personifying those two forces, right? Um, but the scientist in me, as I've interpreted Buddhism, I don't see those as personality forces. I see those as just primordial um, forces in the universe. That I heard somebody ask this question to the Dalai Lama. They said, well, what created samsara? And his response was, well, since anything in existence had causes and conditions create it, and those causes had their causes, we can't find a first cause. If somebody says, what's the first cause? All we can do is scratch our heads because there isn't a beginning. Um, and so the sense is that um, all the continuums of mind have beginninglessly associated with that ignorance of seeing themselves as individual existing from their own side. And that's the Maya, that's the deception, because that's not the real nature of the mind. And so it's not until individuals can see through that they're liberated of it. But as
That
that,
that makes sense because that makes sense. So as because like when I'm studying that stuff, like they have this portion called gnosis, right, which is like this divine wisdom, which is the same thing as that I equate to nirvana, right? It's this divine wisdom, it's a divine experience, and it's really crazy. Like just doing all this, I'm literally mapping one to one, right? It's insane. But that's a common factor I'm seeing is that once the mind or thought started believing it itself existed outside of everything else and it was no longer part of the one, right? Like the whatever everything is. I don't know how to explain it,
yeah,
right?
no, I got you. The whole thing.
Yeah. But once
Yeah.
that happened, like that's when the illusion started taking place because everything started focusing on its own being, its own existence, and started believing it was separate from everything else. And that's what I'm seeing is kind of repeated through everything, whether it's a giant force that created what we consider existence. That's the same thing that would have happened to it, and then it created all these other little minds under it, which is basically just breakoffs of its own mental, right? And it just seems like this repeating pattern. But from what you're saying, that sounds like the same thing that is talked about in Buddhism. They're just not applying nature, which I think in the other ones they call them archons, but those are like uh, if you think about the matrix, it's like the agents in the matrix that protect the structure, right? And they do it by self-imposing, like creating doubt, creating fear, creating jealousy, and all these things. And those are the things that keep you focused on self. Um, and in the Gnostic side, they believe those are it's taught. When I read the text, it doesn't say that, but what's taught is that those are individual like beings that are controlling people, etc. But really, I just think it's like the nature that's creating this lack of creating individualism, right? Kind of like along what you said. So that makes a lot of sense.
Well, there was um, a great, um, very famous, wild yogi named Trungpa Rinpoche. He was kind of controversial figure, and he wrote this poem, or he once said during a Dharma talk, "Once we were all free dancing in space." Until somebody said, "Look at me, I'm dancing." He kind of attributes the beginning to samsara to "look at me, I'm dancing," right? And that kind of so there, as I said, it gets technical, And we're going to get into it in depth in the text that I started going over last time. The last section is totally about this. It's totally about wisdom. Um, but the definition of the object of negation, and that's a really important thought to keep in mind. Object being negated, um, refuted. The object being refuted is anything that exists on its own independently. And so in Buddhism, the refutation of that mistaken idea is dependent origination. There are different types of dependent origination. And actually, I mentioned this book near the beginning of it. The Dalai Lama does a great job just breaking it down really simply. At one level, every compound thing arises because of causes and conditions. And therefore, everything is dependent in that way from a causal way, right? Um, and when you look at causality, there's natural causality of the material world. You know, in physics and chemistry, it gets into how things are made and how they arise in dependence. In biology, there's a biological dependent origination. We all know that we came from the unique substance of our parents, right? And then they fed us. Here we are, right? Um, so there's a biological kind of dependent origination. Similarly, there's a mental dependent origination. There's a kind of causality that's mental. And that's what karma is. Karma simply means action, actions of speech, thought, body. It's all tied into the mind, though. And so within Buddhist idea of dependent origination, how we conceive of things and then what we do with the actions of our body, speech, and mind plant seeds in our continuum that grow over time and give results. And so a lot of the text that we're going to go into gets into that part of dependent origination. And that's where I joked that yesterday Sharon and I were purifying our bad karma, right? Um, so that's one whole area of thought. Another form of dependent origination has to do with relativity. Like, for instance, some people say I'm tall. Well, that concept of being tall is in reference to other people whose height is less than mine, right? Some people would say I'm fat, but that's in reference to other people whose bodies are more slender. And so you think, for instance, of a car. A car is totally dependent and arises in relation to its parts. Without all the different parts, you don't have a functioning car, right? So there's that kind of dependent origination, part whole and relativity, that form, and that's a whole other area of dependent origination. And then there's a third, more subtle form of dependent origination, and this is what this particular school of Buddhism gets into in middle way logic, Madhyamaka, that I'll just say the Tibetan. The Tibetan is tene dak, which means based on a basis of designation. The mind then labels something as existent. So let's take a flower, for example. A flower, you plant a seed, then you got moisture and soil and sun. It grows into a sprout. eventually a flower comes out. Nowhere in that process is that thing thinking I'm a flower. It's not until somebody sees it and says, oh, there's a flower. And that imputation of existence on that phenomena that's growing is then based on the basis doc, then there's a label. So why is this so profound from a Buddhist point of view? Think of yourself and think of your name and what it means to you when somebody says your name. Well, when we really take it apart, at some point we were just a cellular bit of matter in our mother's womb, right? And then that developed over time until our mothers gave birth to us. And then our parents labeled us with a name or somebody named us, right? And then we heard that over time and we started to associate that sound with who we are. And so when you ask, who am I? If you take it apart, you'll find that there are lots of different aspects to all of us, and the biological aspects, the mental aspects. But what ties it together is that labeling process. Oh, there's Wilson, or there's Andre, or there's Sharon, or there's Bobby, right? And so this is important because when we can see it as it is, that we're just established by a mere label, it takes a lot of it brings wisdom into the experience of experiencing ourselves and our world. If we don't think about it and we just follow the labels and we think of them as real, then we start thinking, oh, there's a real car over there, or there's a real flower, as if it exists from its own side independently. And then based on those projections of real existence into ourselves and things, we start to cling. And then the other afflictions of mind grow from there.
So it's funny that you say that. And I've always thought of this was the greatest gift that my mother ever gave me. She regrets it now, right? Because she sees it as though I lack an identity, right? And most people in my race see it as though I lack an identity. When I was very young, my mom told me, I was like, hey, the black person over there, I was like 3 or 4 years old. And she was like, baby, we're not going to call people by their races. You can do it by culture, right? Or you can do it by colors in the crayon box. And I was like, what does that mean? She was like, that person over there is burnt sienna. That person over there is brown. That person's over there peach, right? And so when I was growing up, until I got to high school, even though I grew up in Philadelphia, so it's predominantly black and Hispanic, right? But while I was growing up, I never saw color. I saw cultures, right? And I identified myself as an American, but that was the only culture I had. And then as I got older, I noticed how much hate and resentment and things people had that were based around race. And it was something I couldn't even conceive of, right? It didn't exist to me.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I lacked that identity. It didn't apply to me. And I can see that, right? And I was reading something a few weeks ago, and it was like I think there was somebody did a study where they didn't name children initially for multiple years, and the children didn't. They had an identity of themselves, but there was no. They just were more at peace than what it would have been when you just applied a name and applied all these other structures to them. So that makes a lot of sense. That really resonates with me.
Well, that's what I've noticed too. Young kids who haven't been indoctrinated by their parents, they just tend to see each other as humans and they get into their differences and similarities in a very loving and very wonderful way. And it's not until some twisted adult imposes some kind of negativity based on people's differences that bias develops and then people start to fall apart. Yeah. And it's based on concepts, but they're faulty concepts, you know? So,
I have a question, Wilson. So, and this is similar to the same vein that you're on. So, race is a very good example of where we apply labels, right? There's other social things where we would apply labels too, and I'm going to use the LGBTQIA plus
yeah.
because that acronym itself has been expanding. But I see this as not like an externally imposed or like like you said, an imputation of an identity. This seems to be a group of people going out and getting it and putting it on themselves. Like it keeps expanding. It's not because other people are making it happen. So is this bad? Like, is this counterproductive somehow? I almost think it is. But I risk saying that. Well, when I say that, I risk maybe offending people because there is a claim that people hold their identities very precious. You know, I'm the I in this, or I'm the T in that, or and I do feel like it causes complications that we could otherwise avoid.
Well, I'm going to have to wear my other hat, my social work hat, instead of my Buddhist hat for that question, because um, in social work, there's a guy actually. His name was Fanon. He lived in the last century, and he was born a slave, and he battled against slave owners, and eventually he became a psychiatrist, and he wrote a book called The Psychology of Oppression, and really interesting stuff. His perspective is really very illuminating. But I think my experience is when anybody, because of their features or their circumstance, when they get labeled in a negative way, it's almost it's like a struggle not to internalize that label and to get in touch with who you really are so that that outer negative force doesn't permeate your psyche and start to control you. And so I think a lot of people who've been mislabeled or negatively labeled try to speak up. No, that's not who, here's who I am, right? And in that way, it's a good thing. Like in the LGBT plus, you know, so many derogatory terms are leveled at people in that community. And for people to say, well, I don't really fit that, but here's who I really am. I see that as an attempt for the person to say, hey, I'm human here. I'm not your projection of me, right? But it can get, as you mentioned, it can get kind of absurd, where people get into little fights about little nuances and stuff like that. But how different?
I've actually even seen it within their own community that happens. So but I don't know how you get rid of labels like 100% because it permeates us. I don't like to see somebody as just whatever that label is, though. I know that they're much more than whatever label somebody might put on them. So, I mean, I have an LGBTQ daughter, and you know, so she lives with that label, and we've had discussions about it.
Well, I'll put back on my Buddhist hat.
Okay.
With the Buddhist world, Buddha talked about two truths. He called them relative and absolute. Um, and so relative truth is all of the different things that we label in the world, from a car to a TV to a tree, whatever, the sky. At a relative label, there's some truth to those labels. And I'm not talking about pejorative, like put down labels. I'm talking about just trying to figure out what's what in the world, right? So those labels have a relative value. Like if you're going to build a car, it's good to know what a carburetor is. And it's good to be able to differentiate between that and a wheel, you know? Um, but at an absolute level, if you really look into any of those labels and what they're labeling, the basis being designated by the label also is dependently arisen, and it has parts and it has causation. And if you dig into it, you'll find that there's nothing there that exists from its own side. And so, in that way, all phenomena at their basic level are empty of any self nature. And that's absolute truth. That at that level, there's no difference between any phenomena in the universe, because everything has that empty basis and is dependently arisen. And that, anyway, so that part is absolute. So we'll get into this a little bit more. It's really interesting stuff, I think. All right, so the idea of past and future lives, are people comfortable with it at this point? All right. I
It's
know it's
it's a fun topic. I think I've mentioned before that I do come from a skeptical standpoint generally. It's not that I don't accept it, but I've conditioned myself to be critical, and even materialistic. And in that sense, I don't believe that materialism is the best approach. I think it's faulty and incomplete. But so I might ask questions and seem like I'm playing devil's advocate. I'm not. I'm just trying to
I hope you will, Bobby.
understand.
I hope you will, because any of those questions somebody else has. And so I really want this class to be like that, where we kind of together struggle through some of these concepts. And I think the more people voice questions like that, the more real it'll make the material. Because the material is really interesting. But it starts with that assumption that, because it came out of Buddhist thought, um, where it really starts, you've all heard of the four truths that Buddha taught. This was the first thing he taught after Brahma and Indra asked him to teach. And he looked around like, who do I know that might actually understand the stuff that I have to tell him? And the first people he thought of were the five ascetics who he had practiced asceticism with for 6 years. And so he went to them, and at first they were going to shun him because he had eaten some porridge, and that was outside of their code as ascetics. But when he approached, he was so radiant that they couldn't help themselves. They got up and they prostrated and made a seat for him. And that's where he taught the first teaching that he gave. And he went into the four truths. And the first of those truths just start where we are. It's suffering, right? He thought that that was obvious to everybody. And there are three main forms of it. We have what's called the suffering of suffering. Like my experience of the food poisoning was the suffering of suffering. And at the same time, it was the second form of suffering, the suffering of change. It was a really nice roast beef sandwich I ate. Really enjoyed it. And then later it was hell to pay. And so even the things we love can turn into things that are really painful and distressing, right? So that's the second form of suffering, a little more subtle than the suffering of suffering. And then there's a third form of suffering that the Buddha noticed. And this was the primary one that he overcame while he was sitting under the Bodhi tree. It's called the suffering of conditional existence. And that, to understand the suffering of conditional existence, you have to understand rebirth. The mechanism that causes us to take birth after birth is that based on that thought of me and mine, different afflictions overtake our minds. Primarily, and Freud thought this was the id, he called it the id, primarily desire and anger and jealousy and all those things color the mind, create seeds in the mind, and as those ripen, we take birth helplessly in different conditions, mostly that are miserable. And so any birth in samsara is said to be contaminated. Um, and what it means it's contaminated is that because it's propelled by karma and the afflictions, then the nature of that life will be filled with suffering. And the life itself, like as we get older, we can sense our conditioned quality. One of my teachers said, if you took a 20-year-old and you put them in the body of a 70-year-old, they would go insane. Because our bodies start to deteriorate on us and our faculties start to wane. And it's because we're conditioned, we're conditional. And so based on trying to protect this conditional situation of our present life and body, we do all sorts of things to try to protect ourselves. And that becomes karma for throwing more lives like this in the future. And it's a really bad situation because it takes us from suffering to suffering and more suffering.
In the middle path, do they believe that the the light body or whatever the essence of us chooses the next life based on the karmic debts where you go, so I'll come back as a handicapped person because I'll get more karmic points or I have to go through certain suffering that I haven't learned yet. Is that how it works?
In the Buddhist view, um, it's pretty complex. When you get into it, there are a lot of options there, right? Somebody who's a bodhisattva who decides, I want to become enlightened, not only for myself, but for all beings, to liberate all beings from suffering, bring them to some kind of stable happiness. Somebody on that path, it said that they can reach a stage of development where they can start choosing which life they're going to take based on the needs of others. But it's thought that most of us can't make those choices because we're too under the influence of those impulses and the karma they create. And so that when we die and everything falls apart, whatever the most potent impulse overtakes the mind and shapes what we become. And so it's considered helpless, that we're helplessly propelled into one life after another based on our karma. So it's a pretty bleak situation where we start.
I
And
think
that's where yeah,
I was gonna say, like my understanding of just what I read of Bardo and things like that, it's also often explained as the karmic winds. And
yeah,
that sort of implies that you don't have a choice because the winds are going to blow in the way they go. So, and because you're not realized yet during that moment, you can't get out of it. And so you just get blown away to your next life. That's the way I understood it. And you can correct me if I'm wrong on that.
that's what's considered our situation. The Buddhists have this. I'm going to show you this because it really will answer this in a very powerful way, I think. They have this image that was actually developed by the Buddha. There was a king who wanted to give a gift to a neighboring king, and he asked the Buddha, what kind of gift can I give? And the Buddha had an artist come and then told the artist what to paint. And this is the image that the artist painted, something roughly like this. This is a newer version of it. But it said when the neighboring king saw this, he awoke on the spot. He became enlightened on the spot because all the symbols were clear to him. So in the hub, you can see there's a pig and a rooster and a snake. that pig represents that primordial ignorance of me, mine. And out of it comes the rooster of desire and the snake of hatred. And so that's like the id impulses that Freud talked about. When that's when our mind is contaminated by those forces, that's when we lose, that's when we become helpless. And based on that, when we die, if we've created good karma, but we're still under the influence of these three poisons in the center, then we go up in existence. And that's this part of this inner wheel. These are beings going upward into better lifetimes because of their karma. However, if we've done negative things, then we enter into a lower birth. And here are beings being pulled down through the bardo into a worse life. And then around it are different realms that beings are born in. And at the outer rim are links of how karma is created, how it ripens, and then how it eventually propels us into future birth. All of this is in the jaws of death, because whenever we're born, because our nature is impermanent, we're going to die. That is samsara in a picture. If you want a picture of what the idea of samsara is, outside of it is the Buddha. The Buddha escaped it by understanding it and by eliminating the obstacles of the afflictions and knowledge. And he's pointing to a clear moon, which represents the result of a mind that's been cleared of these poisons, where it's no longer propelled by these poisons. So I often joke that it's like a marquee in a mall. You are here. It's not a pleasant thing, you know. It's scary, you know, and that's why you have to kind of ask yourself, is it true that we're being reborn? And there's a purpose to it. It's not just to scare you silly. It's to get you on to the next step. So the first truth is suffering. The second truth is what causes suffering. And to boil that down into a nutshell, it's karma and afflictions of mind that are creating the suffering that we experience in life after life. And then the third truth is suffering can end. There's a cessation. The Buddha was able to attain it. Many sages and yogis and yoginis have attained it, and you too can attain it. That's what Buddha is telling us. You got Buddha nature, you can attain a state beyond suffering. And then the fourth truth is the path. So what we started last time was the path, that fourth truth. So what's the path to get out of that wheel of samsara and head towards enlightenment? So anyway, that's where we are. Should I go through one more verse? We did one verse last time. But I want to make sure you're asking questions if this is bringing up, well, how about, I'm not sure that I can agree with that. Please
So
feel.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
So, because reading through like the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and it talked about the different things that happen after death, where you end up meeting different beings that represent your, I guess, your inner demons, and it's the main thing is about recognizing the fact that it's not real and recognizing that you should be going in the other direction, right? And that you need to be taken out when someone offers you a hand to say, "Hey, come with me." You just need to go, right?
It's the right hand.
Yes, the right
You want
hand.
to
Don't
grab
you
hold
know?
of the right hand.
But at the end of it, it talks about the judgment that takes place where your soul that doesn't have an ego or a sense of self judges the life and all the things that you've experienced and all the things that you've caused throughout your life. To get to that point, is that the bodhisattvas or is that any person, period? Because it seems like there's an inner circle where the people who are stuck in those the three things that are trapping you, and then there's like an outer part. But when I was reading, I didn't really understand that.
Well, the Book of the Dead is an interesting book. Um, and it's tied in with a whole system of meditation practice. And when the great psychologist Carl Jung read it, he wrote the foreword to it. He made a conjecture that maybe this is how the bardo appears for certain people within a certain cultural context. But for somebody in a different cultural context, it might appear differently. And that tends to be borne out when you read the research of people who research children who remember a previous life. Very often their experience of the intermediate state seems to be based on some cultural factors. Um, and so that sense of judgment, um, the tradition that I've been brought up in, the sense is that there are forms of actions and afflictions where there's nobody outside us that judges us. The nature of those actions and the nature of those motives themselves shape us into what we become. And so no one has to judge if the action was harmful and the motive was negative, then that's going to pull us into a worse state of existence. Whereas if it's a virtuous impulse and a virtuous action, that nature of that cause will just pull us into a good direction. It's like nobody judges outside.
So does that mean if somebody believes that what they're doing is right, um, and they're doing it for a virtuous reason, but it harms others, how does that equate? Because it seems to me like karma should punish you for that, right? But if it's your intent that matters more than anything, you are actually trying to do your best. Like, how does that equate when it comes to the next time that you come back?
So I'll tell you a story. This is out of the sutras. It's a famous story that the Buddha told. He was walking with some of his disciples and he stepped on a thorn and it went through his toe. And of course, his body was hurt. And the disciple said, "You're the Buddha. I thought you were beyond pain. What happened there?" And he told this story that in a previous lifetime he had been on this boat, and there was a man on the boat. It was a trader's boat, so all the passengers were businessmen trying to bring goods to other parts of the world. And there was one person on board who wanted to kill everybody. And the Buddha was evolved enough to see the thoughts of that individual and to see what that karma would do, not only to him, but to everybody on board. And he developed an intense compassion for everybody on board as well as that individual. And so he saw there was no way to stop him from producing that really negative karma except to take his life. And so, based on his compassion for that individual and for all the victims, he threw a spear and it killed the man. And it prevented him from creating a cause that would have thrown him into terrible rebirths and would have destroyed everybody on the boat. And the Buddha said, because of that action, because it was a negative action, I stepped on this thorn. Because of the motive for doing it was to protect and compassion, it became a cause for my enlightenment. So I hope that helps. I mean, it's kind
That's
of,
a beautiful story, and I completely understand it. I got you.
yeah, it's always
If
a
I
The
could
mix.
way
say,
the way
oh,
you
go
were
ahead.
saying that different people had different Bardo stories, but the Bardo, like everything else, is empty.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
why wouldn't that not be so?
And in the Bardo Tudo, the Book of the Dead, it talked about the dawning of these different states. right, related to different aspects of enlightenment. Um, it's complex, and we'll get into all that stuff eventually. But it's really interesting because the Tibetans have really broken down the dying process and what happens to it. What happens physiologically as we're dying, what dawns to the mind during each stage of the death process, and what happens in the bardo, what you experience. And it's fascinating stuff. So we'll go into it eventually. But
If I can just say, like, I appreciate stories like that, but I see I see a little danger in stories like that. And when people like us see stories like that, or we hear stories like that, sorry, my concern is that there are individuals that will see that as a way to absolve themselves. Well, I'm doing this for the greater good, so I'm doing it, and we laugh about it, but I mean,
no, I'm agreeing.
Christians that I know do this all the time. They wipe themselves clean all the time, and then there's, of course, they're mistaken. But then also, I was just thinking about this actually, maybe even earlier today. I don't know what prompted me to think about, it, but I was thinking about the ethical impact of self-defense. Right? If you hurt somebody, or even worse, you kill somebody in self-defense, what are the effects of that? And the Buddhist stance, in comparison to most other systems of belief, is pretty harsh in that sense. Well, you killed somebody; it's wrong.
Yeah.
You know, yes, the degree of impact might be less, karmically speaking, if you did it. You were just doing it out of self-preservation or to defend people you love, but you still killed somebody.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, while
Well,
stories like that are cute, kind of, but there's
the
still
reason I
very deep
chuckled,
ethical.
was what flashed through my mind was a talk I had with one of my teachers, Sermi Khenchen Rinpoche. It was right when Gaddafi, this was probably before you were born, but um, Gaddafi had shot down a passenger plane and killed all the people on it. He was doing these terrorist things. And then the US retaliated, shooting missiles at his palace. He wasn't there, but it killed one of his daughters. It was really tragic. And anyway, I was in the middle of thinking all these things, and I went to Ken Rinpoche and I said, Rinpoche, you know, that news story, is there ever a place for taking life if it's to protect people? And he looked at me and he said, can you grow a tree out of a toothpick? And I said, no, Rinpoche, I can't do that. He said, the Buddha could. He said, when you can do that, you can make those kinds of choices. But more that I've heard also from Gyumi Khensen Rinpoche, it's only a very realized being that is able to get into those kind of wrathful activities, um, and do it without really harming themselves and everybody else.
That's pure motivation, though, right? I mean, that's very purified being with a real pure motivation who knows
Right.
exactly why they're doing it.
And one of the qualifications is they have to have enough clairvoyance to know that by taking the life, they're sending that person to a better
For better place.
and
I have a suggestion for two of you. I found this book really useful. That I like books by His Holiness too. And this is Mind of Clear Light. And so it's advice on living well and dying consciously. So it has some of the stuff that Wilson was talking about. Um, and Bobby, I have an extra copy. When we meet at our next meeting, I'll bring it for you, okay?
Okay.
So
and
I,
one
I like read His Holiness does break things down much simpler than other people. So I like to read his book.
and one more comment to Bobby though. The best thing is to follow the precepts, to avoid killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, divisive speech, abusive speech, frivolous speech, and most of all to avoid hate, desire, and ignorance. And to try to, if you follow those basic 10 precepts, then you're going to be on track. The question comes up when situations won't allow you to keep those 10 precepts of protecting life or telling the truth or whatever it is, and you got to make a choice. That's where it gets dicey. Like if one example is if somebody came to you and said, um, where's your dad? I'm going to go kill him. And your dad was visiting you, it would be a lie to say, oh, he's not here. But it'd be the right thing to do. Right. And so it's not always easy when you're trying to practice those precepts, but those are kind of the guide you should try to do. Anyway, I hope that helps. So I didn't get to the text, but I will next time. I will next time. But I wanted to set it up because what the text is that we're going over is the path. It is that fourth truth that there are paths that will lead you beyond suffering and to enlightenment.
So
So
what is the text that you're referencing? I did watch the video from the last one, but I wasn't here.
the three principal aspects of the path by Tsongkhapa.
Okay.
So I'll come back to it and I'll start there next time. But I wanted to have this discussion because I know that rebirth and karma are not concepts that Westerners easily wrap their minds around. So, okay. Anyway, really good to see you all. And I enjoyed the conversation. And we'll be back in 2 weeks, okay?
Thank you very
All right.
much. And y'all have a
Thank
good
you.
one.
See y'all later.
All
Thank
right.
you. Good night.
Take care.